I never imagined my first meeting with Alexander's family would begin with a word so sharp it cut through the room like broken glass. Street garbage, that's what his father, Maxwell Blackwood, decided to call me in front of 24 polished guests seated around a chandelier-lit dining table. The moment is burned into my memory. My borrowed silk gown suddenly felt like paper. My throat tightened as if invisible hands were trying to silence me. Around me, forks hovered in midair, wine glasses froze halfway to lips, and an awful silence spread across the room. 23 strangers, some curious, some horrified, watched as one of the most powerful men in Boston reduced me to nothing more than trash at his table. Beside me, Alexander's hand tightened around mine under the table. I could feel the tension in his grip, his anger simmering beneath a calm exterior. But his father's eyes, cold and glittering like steel, were fixed solely on me. He wasn't merely insulting me, he was delivering a verdict. To him, my background, my borrowed dress, and my presence in his mansion were crimes of presumption. In that instant, I felt the weight of every whispered doubt I had carried since the day I agreed to attend this dinner. That I didn't belong, that no amount of charm or effort would make me acceptable in their world. That one mistake, one slip, one stain on the tablecloth would confirm I was exactly what they thought I was, an imposter. Yet something unexpected stirred in me. Fear gave way to a strange clarity. The humiliation Maxwell intended as a crushing blow began to ignite something else, a quiet defiance, a strength I didn't know I had been storing up all my life. I could almost hear my sister's voice reminding me, "You are worthy, don't let anyone make you small." Before I reveal how I responded that night, before I tell you what changed everything between me, Alexander, and his family, I want you to pause with me. Imagine sitting at that table, every eye waiting for you to crumble. What would you have done? Would you stay silent, would you run, or would you find your voice? Because my answer to Maxwell Blackwood's cruelty would not only decide the course of that dinner, but it would alter the future of his empire, my career, and the relationship I had believed might be the love of my life. This story is not just about an insult, it is about what happens when a single word meant to destroy instead becomes the spark that sets an entirely different fire. 7 months before that fateful dinner, I was just another barista behind the counter of Maple Street Cafe, a modest little coffee shop tucked between tall glass towers in Boston's financial district. My world was a swirl of espresso shots, clinking cups, and hurried suits dashing in for their caffeine before another long day. I never thought that love or scandal would ever find me there. Every morning at exactly 7:30, a man came in and ordered the same thing, a black coffee with 1 sugar. At first, I barely noticed him among the endless stream of executives who barked orders without eye contact, phones glued to their ears. But he was different. He said, "Please." He said, "Thank you." And he always left a tip that felt generous for a simple cup of coffee. What struck me most wasn't the money but his manner. His blue eyes were kind, and he carried himself with a calm that stood out in a sea of rushed, impatient people. When he smiled, there was warmth in it, the kind that made my stomach flutter even when I tried to brush it off. 3 weeks passed this way before I finally teased him. "You must really like our coffee." He looked up from his laptop, paused, and then said, "Actually, I do, but I also like the atmosphere and the service." His gaze lingered on me a little longer than it needed to, and I felt my cheeks heat up. That was the first spark. His name was Alexander Blackwood, though at the time that meant nothing to me. To me, he was just Alexander, the polite regular with the easy smile. He started staying longer after getting his coffee, sometimes asking about my classes or my life. Between steaming milk and pulling shots, I told him pieces of myself. That I was from a small Ohio town, raised by a single mom who worked multiple jobs, that I was studying graphic design at night and often had to choose between buying a textbook or paying my electric bill. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen. "That takes determination," he said one morning, his voice full of genuine admiration. Most people I know had everything handed to them, including me, if I'm being honest. It was the first tiny glimpse of the divide between our worlds, though I didn't realize how wide that gap truly was. A month later, he asked me to dinner. I nearly said no, fearful, insecure, convinced he couldn't be serious, but curiosity and that undeniable warmth in his eyes won out. We went to a small Italian restaurant, cozy but nicer than any place I would have chosen on my own. The food was good, but it was the conversation that made the night unforgettable. We talked about art, books, dreams, and disappointments. When he mentioned he worked in his family's company, Blackwood Industries, I nodded politely, not realizing the magnitude of that name. Later that night, I Googled it and my stomach dropped. Alexander wasn't just a nice guy from the cafe, he was the son of Maxwell Blackwood, the billionaire whose face appeared on the covers of business magazines. I almost canceled our second date. We were too different, I told myself, too far apart, but then Alexander called, his voice warm and unpretentious, telling me how much he enjoyed our evening. Against my better judgment, I agreed to see him again. That choice, aid in a moment of hope, would change everything. Over the next 6 months, Alexander and I built something I had never thought possible, a relationship that felt both extraordinary and entirely natural. He had money, connections, and a last name that carried weight in every boardroom in Boston. I had student loans, late rent notices, and a habit of stretching one meal into two. On paper, we were worlds apart. But when we were together, those differences seemed to melt away. Alexander never made me feel like I was less. He didn't flinch when I suggested my favorite diner over a fancy restaurant. He didn't roll his eyes when I got excited over a $50 bonus at work. In fact, he seemed fascinated by my excitement, as though the smallest victories reminded him of something he'd long forgotten. He showed a surprising interest in my graphic design projects. I'd spread my sketches across my tiny kitchen table, embarrassed by the mess, but he would study them carefully, asking thoughtful questions. "You've got real talent," he told me more than once. "Any company would be lucky to have you." His encouragement made me believe in myself in ways I hadn't before. When he finally said, "I love you," it wasn't in some grand, sweeping gesture. We were walking by the Charles River at sunset, the water glinting with fading light, and he just said it, simple and certain. My heart nearly burst. I told him I loved him too, not because of his wealth, not because of the world he came from, but because of who he was when it was just us. Kind, genuine, and steady. Of course, there were reminders that our lives were stitched from very different fabrics. He talked casually about childhood ski trips in the Alps while I quietly remembered winters spent wrapping myself in extra blankets when the heat got shut off. He didn't understand why I was thrilled to find a designer dress at a thrift store faux. But he listened and learned, never dismissing what mattered to me. For 6 months, we lived in our bubble. The financial district regular with the blue eyes and the barista with design dreams. We built something real, something that felt sturdy despite the cracks of difference underneath. But deep down, I wondered, could love survive the weight of family expectation? I never pressed him about his parents or siblings. Part of me was afraid to know too much, afraid that seeing the full scope of his world would remind me of how small mine was. And maybe part of him wanted to protect me from that too. The name Blackwood loomed like a shadow I tried to ignore. Still, I told myself love was stronger than class. That if we kept choosing each other, it would be enough. When he looked at me, I didn't feel like a girl from Ohio scraping by. I felt like someone worthy of admiration, respect, and even love. It was easy to believe that maybe the differences didn't matter. Easy to imagine a future where we carved out a space of our own away from expectations and privilege. But life has a way of reminding you that worlds don't just stay separate, they collide. And when they do, sparks can light up the sky or burn everything down. I didn't know it yet, but the invitation to his grandparents' anniversary dinner would be the test. The moment when the walls of our bubble would shatter and I'd be forced to stand toe-to-toe with the people who saw me not as Alexander's equal, but as an unworthy outsider. At the time, I just knew I was in love. And I wanted to believe love was enough. The invitation came on a rainy Tuesday night when Alexander and I were curled up on my tiny secondhand sofa sharing takeout and watching an old black and white movie. My apartment was nothing special, uneven floorboards, mismatched furniture, and a leaky faucet that dripped no matter how tightly I turned the handle. But Alexander never seemed to mind. He was stretched up beside me, his arm draped lazily across my shoulders as if this little space was the coziest place in the world. Then he paused the screen, turned to me, and said, "My grandparents are celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary next month. There's going to be a formal dinner at the estate. I'd really like you to come with me." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Estate, dinner, grandparents, and worst of all, family. I could already feel my stomach twisting in knots. "You mean..." I hesitated, searching for words. "Meet your entire family at once?" He nodded, his expression a mixture of hope and, was that anxiety? "It's a big deal, I know, but we've been together for 6 months, and you're important to me. I want them to meet you." I forced a smile, though my heart was racing. "How many people will be there?" "About 30, mostly family, some close friends, and a few business associates." He squeezed my hand, his voice steady. "I know it sounds intimidating, but they'll love you. How could they not?" His confidence was touching, but it did little to calm my nerves. For the next 3 weeks, the thought of that dinner consumed me. Every free moment, I spiraled into worry. What would I wear? What would I say? What if I picked up the wrong fork or mispronounced a word and branded myself an imposter forever? My best friend, Sophia, became my sounding board. Over coffee one Sunday, I poured out my fears while she listened with patient amusement. Finally, she set her cup down and said, "You need a killer dress, something that makes you feel unstoppable." We scoured department stores that afternoon, but everything suitable for such a formal event was far beyond my budget. $400 for a gown I'd wear once? That was half my rent. Seeing my dismay, Sophia smiled knowingly. "I still have that midnight blue silk gown from my cousin's wedding. It would fit you perfectly with a few alterations, and don't argue, you're borrowing it, and my pearl earrings too." I protested weakly, but inside I felt relief wash over me. The week before the dinner, I practiced walking in heels around my apartment until my ankles ached. I binge-watched etiquette videos, memorizing which utensil belonged to which course. I even read up on the Blackwood family's history, hoping to contribute intelligently as conversation turned to business. The night before the event, my sister Elaine called. She'd always been my rock, the one who steadied me when life felt overwhelming. Her voice was firm but kind. "Just remember who you are. You're smart, kind, and worthy of respect, no matter how much money anyone else has. Don't let them make you feel small." I clung to her words. The next evening, dressed in midnight silk and borrowed pearls, I barely recognized the reflection in the mirror. When Alexander arrived to pick me up, his odd expression made every anxious hour of preparation feel worth it. "You look breathtaking," he whispered, kissing me softly. Still, as we drove toward the Blackwood estate, my nerves returned. The streets grew wider, the homes grander, until finally we turned onto a tree-lined private road. At the end stood a mansion that looked like something out of a period drama, all marble columns and manicured gardens. "You grew up here?" I whispered. Alexander nodded, sheepish. "Home, sweet home. Ready?" I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready, but I straightened my back, replayed my sister's words in my mind, and told myself, I belong. I am worthy. I will not let them see me crumble. The dining room at the Blackwood estate was a theater of wealth and control. A long mahogany table stretched beneath a chandelier that shimmered like a constellation. Silverware gleamed, wine glasses sparkled, and fresh flowers softened the air with perfume. But for me, none of it mattered. What mattered was where I had been seated, directly across from Maxwell Blackwood. It was no accident. I could feel it in the way his eyes. A gaze locked on me as soon as I sat down. To my right, Alexander whispered reassuringly, "Just a normal dinner with expensive wine." But the tension in his hand gripping mine told another story. The first course arrived, a delicate soup I couldn't even name. I copied the movements of others, careful not to choose the wrong spoon. Around the table, conversations buzzed, stock portfolios, European boarding schools, summer homes in the south of France. I kept quiet, sipping wine in small doses just to steady my hands. Every time Alexander tried to draw me in, I felt the spotlight tighten on my outsider status. Then Maxwell's voice sliced through the chatter. "So, Miss Miller," he said loudly enough for the room to hush, "Alexander tells me you work in a coffee shop." The question hung in the air like a trap. I placed my spoon down carefully. "Yes, sir, Maple Street Cafe. It helps pay for my education." His eyebrow rose. "Education? And what exactly are you studying?" "Graphic design. I'll graduate next spring." "Graphic design," he repeated, his tone dry, dismissive. "Making posters and such." Alexander cut in, his voice sharp. "Actually, Father, Jacqueline's work focuses on brand identity and digital marketing solutions. She's very talented." Maxwell ignored him, turning back to me. "And where did you say you're from originally?" "A small town in Ohio, Millfield." "Never heard of it." He sipped his wine. "And your father? What does he do?" The table stiffened. Maxwell's eyes glittered, already knowing the answer. "My father left when I was young," I said evenly. "My mother raised my sister and me on her own." "And what does she do, your mother?" "She works in retail now. Before that, she cleaned houses, waited tables, whatever it took to support us." From a few seats down, Eleanor, Alexander's grandmother, murmured approvingly, "A strong woman." But Maxwell's mouth twitched. D downward. Indeed. From service work to service work through the generations. Fascinating. Alexander's fork hit the plate harder than intended. Jacqueline's mother made incredible sacrifices. She should be admired, not mocked. The servers cleared plates, but the sting lingered. Maxwell's questions didn't stop. He asked about my accent, about whether I'd ever traveled to Europe, about whether I had discovered intellectual curiosity later in life. Each question was dressed as polite conversation but carried the same message. You don't belong here. By the time the main course, a tenderloin plated like artwork, arrived, my nerves were frayed. My hand trembled as I reached for my wine glass. I misjudged the distance and tipped it slightly, sending a few crimson drops onto the pristine white tablecloth. I'm so sorry, I gasped, mortified. A server rushed in with a napkin. Alexander touched my hand. It's fine. Don't worry. But then came the chuckle. Maxwell's cold, amused laugh. Careful with that, he said, his voice booming down the table. That wine costs more than you probably make in a week. Silence fell. Heat flushed my face as 23 pairs of eyes burned into me. Father, that's enough, Alexander snapped, his voice tight with fury. Maxwell leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass. Merely stating facts. No need to be so sensitive. He turned back to me, now openly enjoying my humiliation. Tell me, Miss Miller, is that dress from this season's collection? I don't recall seeing it in my wife's wardrobe. The cruelty was clear, my throat tightened, but I managed. It belongs to a friend. She was kind enough to lend it to me for tonight. Ah, Maxwell said, eyes glittering. Borrowed finery, I thought as much. Alexander pushed back his chair, half rising. Father, I will not sit here while you insult her. Sit down, Maxwell ordered. If your friend is to be part of this world, she should develop thicker skin. I could feel the humiliation tightening around me like a noose, pressing me into silence. Oh, and yet, something inside me shifted. My skin was thick, it had to be. I had survived worse than cruel words at a dinner table. My skin is plenty thick, Mr. Blackwood, I said quietly. It had to be, growing up the way I did. For the first time, his smugness flickered. He set down his glass, leaned forward, and let his voice drop into something lethal, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Let me be clear, Miss Miller. My son may be temporarily amused by slumming it with you, but make no mistake. You are street garbage in a borrowed dress, and you will never belong in this family or this world. The words dropped like a hammer. Around the table, eyes widened, mouths fell open, and stillness froze the room. And in that silence, I felt something stir, not fear, not shame, but the steady rise of a storm I hadn't realized I carried inside me. For a moment after Maxwell's words, street garbage in a borrowed dress, time seemed to stop. My ears rang with the insult, my blood cold yet burning at the same time. 23 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, waiting for me to break. Maxwell leaned back with satisfaction as if he had delivered a killing blow. But instead of collapsing, something inside me steadied. It was the quiet, rooted strength that comes only from a lifetime of being underestimated, overlooked, and pushed aside. I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the borrowed blue silk gown with deliberate calm. My movements were slow enough to make people lean forward, waiting. I lifted my water glass, took a sip, and set it down with care. Then I met Maxwell's eyes. Street garbage, I repeated, my voice steady and clear. What an interesting choice of words. A murmur rippled through the table. Maxwell's smirk faltered. I want to thank you, I continued, because I've been struggling with a moral dilemma for months, and you've just made my decision remarkably easy.
Brow furrowed. What are you babbling about?
I let my gaze sweep the table before returning to him. Alexander believes I only work at a coffee shop. That's partly true. I do work there mornings, but for the past 2 years, I've also been working as a part-time investigative journalist for the Boston Sentinel. Gasps, whispers, a shifting of silverware against china. Alexander's hand went still against the table. Maxwell's knuckles whitened around his fork. 6 months ago, I said evenly, before I ever met your son, I was assigned to a team investigating corporate fraud in the shipping industry. One name kept surfacing, yours, Mr. Blackwood. Now the color drained from his face. Our investigation uncovered evidence that Blackwood Industries systematically falsified environmental compliance reports for its cargo fleet. Waste dumped into protected waters, carbon emissions falsified, bribes paid to inspection officials in 3 different countries. The dining room was utterly silent, every guest frozen in disbelief. Maxwell tried to sneer, but his lips tightened instead. When I realized who Alexander was, I disclosed my relationship to my editor and removed myself from the investigation, I said. I even convinced the paper to delay publication while we sought additional corroboration. I wanted to protect Alexander from an impossible conflict of interest. Alexander turned to me, his face torn between shock and confusion. "Jacqueline, is this true?" I nodded. "Yes, I didn't tell you because I didn't want to put you in an impossible position, but everything we uncovered was real." Maxwell slammed his hand against the table. "This is preposterous. You're making wild accusations with no basis." I smiled faintly. "You're welcome to believe that, but the Sentinel's lawyers have already vetted every document, photograph, and recording. The story was ready to run 3 months ago. I was the one who asked them to wait." Gasps again. A glass clinked nervously at the far end of the table. Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest. Henry's expression darkened. Maxwell's voice rose. "You little nothing. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I will destroy you." "You can try," I said calmly, but it won't change the evidence." I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady as I typed a short message. "That was a text to my editor," I said aloud, locking eyes with Maxwell. "I've just removed my objection to publication. The Sentinel will run the full investigation at midnight tonight." The room erupted. Guests whispered, some stood, some made hurried exits. Victoria's eyes were wide with astonishment, but also admiration. Maxwell surged halfway out of his chair. "You used my son to get close to this family, didn't you?" "No," I said firmly. "I fell in love with him despite who you are, not because of it. When I realized the conflict, I stepped away from the story. My mistake was thinking delaying the truth would protect anyone." Alexander stood now, his face pale but resolute. "Father, I've seen those compliance reports. I've questioned them for years. I believe her." Maxwell's face turned purple with rage. "You ungrateful boy. Everything you stand to inherit and you side with this nobody?" "Her name," Alexander said firmly, is Jacqueline. "And yes, I do." Silence crackled like electricity. Maxwell's authority had finally been pierced. His empire of intimidation suddenly looked fragile. From the head of the table, Henry Blackwood finally rose. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of decades. "Maxwell, my office, now." Maxwell sputtered but obeyed, storming from the dining room. Evelyn followed, her face a mask of cold fury. Guests began slipping away, murmuring apologies, unwilling to remain in the fallout. I stood there, trembling only slightly, my phone still in my hand. My life had just shifted in an irreversible way. I had chosen truth over comfort, integrity over silence. And though I feared what it might cost me with Alexander, I knew one thing. Maxwell's attempt to break me had done the opposite. He had set me free. The moment Henry Blackwood summoned his son from the dining room, the air shifted. Conversations broke into hurried whispers, chairs scraped against the polished floor, and one by one, guests began slipping away. What was meant to be a celebratory anniversary dinner had disintegrated into a public unmasking of a billionaire. Alexander turned to me, his face pale, his blue eyes clouded with shock. "Jacqueline," he began, but the words faltered. "I should go," I said quietly. My voice sounded stronger than I felt. Inside, I was trembling, my stomach twisted with equal parts relief and dread. I had spoken the truth, I had done my job, but in doing so, I had detonated a bomb at the center of his family. "I'll drive you," Alexander insisted, reaching for my hand. I pulled back gently. "No, you need to be with your family tonight. This isn't just my fight, it's yours too. Call me tomorrow if you still want to." His mouth opened as if to argue, but he only nodded. There was too much chaos around us for either of us to think clearly. As I gathered my things, Eleanor Blackwood approached. She took my hands in hers, her touch surprisingly warm. "My dear," she said softly, "you showed remarkable courage tonight. No one has stood up to Maxwell like that in decades." "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean to ruin your celebration." Her lips curved into a sad but approving smile. 60 years of marriage teaches you that truth, however unpleasant, is always better than comfortable lies." Her words followed me as I walked out of the mansion alone, the night air wet. Cool, the sky overcast, and when the taxi pulled away, I watched the grand estate shrink into the distance. I had walked in nervous and small. I was leaving with my head held high, but my heart was breaking. Back in my apartment, I didn't sleep. My phone buzzed with a message from my editor. "Got your text, running the story at midnight. Are you okay?" I stared at the glowing screen, my chest tightening. "Yes," I typed back. It was the right decision. But as I hit send, tears blurred my vision. Not because of Maxwell's cruelty, not even because of the scandal about to explode, but because in standing up for truth, I might have lost the man I loved. By morning, the headlines screamed across Boston. Blackwood Industries, environmental fraud and corruption exposed. My byline appeared alongside 2 senior reporters. The article laid everything bare. Falsified compliance reports, bribed officials, photographs, recordings, memos. It was airtight. By noon, Blackwood stock had plunged 20%. By evening, federal agencies announced preliminary investigations. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Maxwell Blackwood's empire trembled, and I was the woman who had lit the fuse. Colleagues flooded my phone with congratulations, my editor offered me a permanent position, other publications sent offers. Professionally, I had just crossed into the next level of my career. And yet, I felt hollow. Every call I received was from strangers or coworkers, not from Alexander, not from the one person whose voice I longed to hear. When my sister Elaine finally reached me, she didn't sugarcoat anything. You did the right thing, that man was a monster, and you stood up not just for yourself, but for everyone he's ever crushed. Then why, I whispered, staring out at the rain-slick streets below my window, does it feel like I've lost everything? Because you care about A.
Alexander, she said gently, and because doing the right thing often comes at a personal cost.
She was right. I had gained a victory for truth, but at the possible cost of love. And as the world celebrated my courage, I wondered if my heart could endure what came next. 3 days after the article went live, I returned to Maple Street Cafe. It felt surreal to tie on my apron, knowing my name was plastered across national headlines. Customers stole furtive glances at me, some whispering behind their cups. A few offered small nods of respect, but most just wanted their morning lattes. I craved the routine, the grounding normalcy of coffee orders and milk foam, even as the world outside spun with chaos. At 11 a.m., the door opened and the cafe went silent. Maxwell Blackwood stood in the doorway, looking nothing like the untouchable patriarch I had seen at dinner. His face was drawn, his immaculate suit slightly rumpled, his aura of command dimmed. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, steadying my voice, what can I get you?" "A word, in private." My manager stiffened, stepping forward. "Sir, if you're here to harass my employee, It's okay," I said quickly. I'll take my break." I led Maxwell to a corner table far from the other customers. The tension between us was sharp enough to slice. "Have you come to threaten me in person?" I asked. He stared at me, unblinking. "I underestimated you." "Most people do," I replied. It's both my burden and my advantage." His jaw tightened. "My lawyers advise me your reporting is factually accurate, selectively presented, but accurate. They believe a lawsuit would fail and only draw more attention." "Is that an admission of guilt?" "It's an acknowledgement of your thoroughness, Maxwell," he said stiffly. "The board has placed me on administrative leave. Investigations are underway. My life's work is being dismantled because of you." "No," I corrected, "because of your choices. You and your executives chose profit over compliance, secrecy over responsibility. You did this, not me." His eyes narrowed. "What would it take for you to back off? Money, a position, name your price." I stared at him, almost stunned. "You still don't understand. This was never about money, it was about truth, accountability." He scoffed. "Truth? Do you have any idea what it will cost? Hundreds of jobs, communities tied to this company's success, ruined." "That's not on me," I said firmly. "That's on you." For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Regret, fear, humanity. It vanished quickly. He stood abruptly, his voice lower. "My son hasn't been home in days. His mother is beside herself. Whatever game you're playing with him—" "I love Alexander," I interrupted, my voice cracking slightly. "This was never a game. I haven't heard from him since that night." Maxwell studied me, his expression unreadable, then walked out without another word. For the first time, I saw not power in his stride, but fragility. That evening, as I chopped vegetables in my small kitchen, there was a knock at my door. My heart leapt before I even opened it. Alexander stood there, unshaven, exhausted, his blue eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," I whispered back. "Can I come in?" We sat across from each other on my sofa, silence stretching between us. Then we both spoke at once. "I should have told you." I should have called. A ghost of a smile flickered across his face. Ladies first. I drew in a shaky breath. I should have told you about the investigation. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was afraid of losing you. And I should have called sooner, he said quietly. I needed time to process, to look at the evidence myself, to confront him, and I did. The evidence is irrefutable. Worse than even your article suggested. His voice broke. My whole life, I looked up to him. I thought he was ruthless.
Yes, but at least principled. Now I see he's neither. I reached for his hand. I'm sorry.
He squeezed mine. I'm sorry too. Sorry you had to endure his cruelty before I found the courage to stand against him. Sorry I doubted you. Tears burned my eyes. What happens now? With the company, he sighed. Grandfather is stepping back in as interim CEO. We're cooperating with investigators preparing restitution. With us? His gaze softened. I don't want to end this. I love you, but if we move forward, it has to be with complete honesty. No more secrets. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. No more secrets. For the first time since that dinner, hope stirred again. The road ahead would be messy, painful, uncertain. But sitting there, hand in hand, we both knew the fight wasn't over. Not for justice, not for love. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever lived through. On one hand, my career surged forward. The Sentinel offered me a full-time position, and other publications reached out with job offers. People who had never once glanced my way at industry events were suddenly calling me brave and fearless. Yet in the quiet moments, away from headlines and accolades, I was just Jacqueline again, tired, uncertain, and clinging to the fragile threads of a relationship that had nearly unraveled. Alexander and I agreed to start over, but starting over didn't mean erasing what had happened. It meant dragging every scar, every wound into the light and learning how to live with them. There were nights we talked until dawn, hashing through painful truths. Nights where anger flared, his at being left in the dark, mine at being doubted in the moment I needed him most. But each time, instead of retreating, we stayed, we listened, we fought to understand. It wasn't romantic in the storybook sense. It was raw, often messy, and at times exhausting. But slowly, through honesty and stubborn determination, we began piecing together something new. A relationship not based on bubbles of escape, but on deliberate choice. Alexander made his own break from the past. He resigned from Blackwood Industries, walking away from the inheritance his father had always used as leverage. He poured his savings into a foundation that supported ethical business practices and funded environmental restoration projects. Many of his first hires were former Blackwood employees, innocent workers left adrift in the wake of the scandal. I can't undo what my father did, he told me, but I can help build something better. I threw myself into my writing too, not just the corporate fraud, but its aftermath. I interviewed employees who had lost their jobs, scientists who studied the polluted waters, and whistleblowers who had been silenced for years. The guilt I carried for the collateral damage became fuel for a new series about accountability and rebuilding. Together, we found a rhythm. He worked longer hours than he ever had under his father, but this time with purpose. I spent late nights drafting articles, sometimes with Alexander asleep beside me, his hand resting over mine as if to remind me that we were still tethered. There were setbacks. His mother, Evelyn, refused to speak to me. She clung fiercely to Maxwell, appearing at his side during court hearings with her chin held high, eyes cold whenever they met mine. That wound cut Alexander deeply, but he didn't waver. She made her choice, he said. Now I'm making mine. Victoria, his sister, surprised us both by becoming an unlikely ally. Over coffee one morning, she leaned across the table and said, "You showed more backbone in one dinner than I've seen in 20 years of family gatherings. You might just save us all." But the most unexpected support came from Henry and Eleanor. Instead of resentment, they reached out. "We built this company on principles," Henry told us during a quiet tea lunch. "Somewhere along the way, Maxwell forgot them. You forced a reckoning. Painful, yes, but necessary." Eleanor took my hand. "You reminded this family what integrity looks like, dear. For that, I thank you." Little by little, I stopped feeling like an outsider looking in. I began to see myself not as the coffee shop girl who stumbled into the wrong dining room, but as someone who belonged because I had earned my place through truth and courage. For the first time in my life, I didn't measure myself against wealth or pedigree. I measured myself against the promises I made to myself, to stand tall, to tell the truth, to never let anyone make me feel small. And in that, I found not just love, but identity. 8 months after that disastrous dinner, the name Blackwood was no longer synonymous with power and prestige. It had become a cautionary tale. The scandal I helped expose snowballed into one of the largest corporate fraud cases of the decade. Federal agencies confirmed years of violations, falsified environmental reports, and a web of bribes stretching across multiple countries. Maxwell Blackwood was indicted on charges of fraud, bribery, and violations of the Clean Water Act. Several top executives faced similar charges. In boardrooms and on news panels, Blackwood Industries became the textbook example of what happens when greed and arrogance go unchecked. The company's once stable stock plummeted, losing nearly 40% of its value. Entire divisions were shut down or sold off, leaving hundreds of employees uncertain about their futures. Those were the consequences I wrestled with most, the ordinary workers who had no knowledge of executive corruption but who paid the price for it. People who lost jobs, pensions, and security because of decisions made far above their heads. Some nights I lay awake, guilt pressing heavy on my chest, wondering if I had ruined lives in pursuit of truth. "You can't take responsibility for what Maxwell chose," my editor reminded me. "He hurt those employees, not you." Still, I needed to do more than just expose corruption. I needed to help tell the stories of those who suffered because of it, so I launched a new series focusing on the human cost of corporate fraud. I interviewed displaced workers, families forced to leave homes, and environmental scientists documenting polluted coastlines. I spoke with whistleblowers who had tried to sound alarms but were silenced by fear of retaliation. And I sought out examples of hope. Companies that had reformed after scandal. Communities that rebuilt. Leaders who had turned failures into second chances. The work gave me purpose. Each story wasn't just an exposé, it was a call to action pointing readers toward ways to help and rebuild. For the first time, I felt like my voice carried weight. Not because I was loud, but because I was relentless. Alexander was walking his own parallel path. He had severed ties with Blackwood Industries completely, despite pressure from relatives to come home and restore the family name. Instead, he threw himself into his foundation. What began as a small effort grew rapidly, funding environmental restoration projects, advocating for ethical business practices, and most importantly, hiring workers who had lost their jobs in the fallout. "I can't erase what my father did," he told me one evening as we walked along the harbor, the city lights reflecting off the water, "but I can create something good from the wreckage." We were still rebuilding ourselves too. The fractures in our relationship hadn't vanished, but they were healing. Honesty had become our anchor. There were no more hidden truths, no more unspoken fears. We spoke openly about pain, about doubt, about what we wanted our lives to stand for. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. His family remained fractured. Evelyn avoided me altogether, her loyalty to Maxwell unshaken. She appeared at his art hearings with her chin raised high, eyes like ice whenever they met mine. But Victoria stood by us. "Someone had to burst the Blackwood bubble," she joked, though her voice carried the weight of years spent under her father's dominance. Most surprising of all was the bond I formed with Henry and Eleanor. They had every reason to resent me for what I'd done, yet they didn't. Instead, they embraced me. "Profit without integrity is meaningless," Henry said during one of our lunches. "We lost sight of that. You forced us to remember." Eleanor squeezed my hand. "You gave this family a chance at redemption, my dear. Don't ever doubt that." Looking back, I realized Maxwell's insult, street garbage, had been meant to crush me. Instead, it became the catalyst for everything that followed. My career, my voice, my love, and my place in a world I had once thought would never accept me. Justice had taken its course, and the legacy of his cruelty was not the empire he tried to preserve, but the strength it unearthed in me. On the anniversary of our first date, Alexander and I returned to the little Italian restaurant where it all began. No fanfare, no photographers, no boardrooms or scandals, just us, seated at a small table tucked in the corner, surrounded by the hum of quiet conversation and the clinking of glasses. After dinner, he reached across the table, his fingers lacing through mine. "I've been thinking about something my grandmother said," he told me. "She said the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they stand for, what they're willing to fight for." I smiled. She's a wise woman. She also said that when you find someone who makes you want to be your best self, you should never let them go. His voice softened. "You stood up to my father when no one else would. You held a mirror to everything my family tried to hide. and you stayed even when it would have been easier to walk away. And you stood with me when it would have been easier to deny me, I said. That took just as much courage. Later that night, we walked along the Charles River, the same place he had first told me he loved me. The city lights shimmered on the water, and the air was cool against our skin. He stopped, turned to me, and said softly, "My father called you street garbage in a borrowed dress, but you showed everyone in that room what true class and integrity look like. You taught me that worth has nothing to do with wealth." His words settled deep in me. For months, I had carried the sting of Maxwell's cruelty. But standing there, I realized something profound. What was meant to break me had instead forged me. Empires built on lies eventually collapse. But relationships built on truth, on honesty, respect, and courage can withstand anything. As we continued walking, I thought about the journey, about how humiliation became empowerment, how doubt became clarity, how insult became identity. Maxwell's words had branded me as garbage, but in the process, he forced me to discover my own gold, my strength, my voice, my unshakable sense of worth. To anyone listening to my story, I'll say this: sometimes the people who try hardest to diminish you end up giving you the greatest gift. They remind you of who you are, what you stand for, and why you'll never bow to anyone's definition but your own. So let me ask you, what moments in your life forced you to stand tall when someone tried to make you small? Share your story. I'd love to hear it. And if mine resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need the reminder. Your worth isn't defined by judgment, but by integrity. Because sometimes it takes being called garbage to discover you were gold all along.